how's the market in Australia developing, Tony, and your experience on the travel security side? Are you seeing any changes for the better, or do you think it's tending to go backwards? I mean, obviously, the inability of companies to adjust to COVID shows not many companies were able to sit back, understand the difference between emergency and crisis, let alone how to manage it, have their teams set up. Australia's obviously showing a bit of inflexibility in how its government's managing it. It's deeming itself to be successful, but choosing one vaccine provider for the entire population. I mean, you come up with that at Duntroon, you wouldn't have even got to a border studies, mate. You would have got to the back of a removal truck with your gear.
Yeah, the Australian market has, and as we've discussed previously, the Australian market, jokingly, we've always said was 20 years behind the rest of the international market. Now everyone sees it. So in reality, what the major consulting, to your point before, what the major consulting companies and expert professions are not telling people or not implying within their service delivery when it comes to security is that of knowledge workers. So in the industrial age, thinking around, standing around the, making Henry Ford's vehicles or working in factory and industrialised areas, with the industrialised sort of globalisation of affairs, you're not geographically bound by where the talent is anymore. That is, the blacksmith doesn't have to live 30 minutes to 60 minutes from where he actually works. You can connect anywhere. So the scales of knowledgeness is now being considered with this geo-arbitrage, and that is that individuals and expertise is essentially ubiquitous. You can access them anywhere. So with a reasonable enough internet connection and with a reasonable device, you can get expertise from anywhere on the planet now. You don't have to travel for that. That is now done through virtual and digital connection. So the Australian market has been changed of late because nearly 2 million Australians have returned back to Australia during COVID, during the pandemic. So there's a lot of international talent that is extremely frustrated and overwhelmed by just how parochial and outdated a lot of Australian businesses and functions are. They are attempting to stimulate growth and better practices, but that is difficult when the rearguard that stayed behind and have become customised or normalised with the way things are done don't want the things to change. As Machiavelli said, is that people that benefit from no change are the ones that are benefiting from the current system as it is. So the Australian market in itself is borderless, particularly when it comes to security, particularly when it comes to threats. But the Australian market hasn't realised that. So as you said, you've still got a very traditional market that thinks it's bricks and mortars, that thinks it's expensive rental in the CBD, which is empty because all the banks left and the big fours left and the law firms left. And now they can't get people back into those facilities because they realised that knowledge workers can work for anyone all around the world, and that's what they're doing.
It's interesting you use the word overwhelmed. It's almost... Recently, I went back to, well, not recently, but 18 months ago, I went back and several meetings in Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra, and everybody was so driven by compliance and everybody was so dependent on public service mentalities, particularly, not only, but particularly in Canberra. I actually found it quite underwhelming in that the costs, the expenditure going into paying consulting firms and consultants and the number of ex-military providing a service to public servants that are overseeing or related to a military role was such that it didn't matter how good the advice was, it was limited by two factors. It was limited by the people they were giving that advice to didn't understand most of it, not because it wasn't good advice, just their base knowledge was at such a low level they couldn't understand the terminology, or that the complexity couldn't be just simplified down to what they could understand. And the second issue was the very, on paper, the very talented and very well-trained people that were giving them the advice, but their lack of experience outside of a security agency well-funded by the government, deploying as a very well-funded force, as a part of a multinational force, that had all its internal IT, its cyber, its communications was all provided for it, its physical security was provided for it, its logistics. Whereas suddenly, okay, you're now out, and as you said, the issues are borderless, they're complex, but that framework of these quite brilliant guys wasn't necessarily yet adjusted to experiences beyond a very well-funded, very well-supported force for very clear objectives. Whereas what we find interacting with the type of clients we do, very complex multinationals. When I say complex multinationals, not only are they complex, but their footprints are very broad, very diverse. Their management teams are a lot more agile. We see the banking sector has a very staved way of dealing with risk. They tend to have about 300 cybersecurity guys every time they need one. And they think cyber is a separate part of risk. They don't integrate their cyber and their physical security, or at least they think they do, but they do it so inefficiently. They've got their own growth of these various security departments becomes an internal monolithic monster they can't manage, and their way of dealing with it is to get more specialists into it, which compounds the problem. Then we see oil and gas and construction and these other companies that are very mature and have a very broad exposure, having extremely lean teams, very talented teams, very not only experienced in terms of how long they've been in the roles, but more importantly, what they've been exposed to. Whereas what I was underwhelmed about with Australia is how many myopic people thought the same and didn't know what they didn't know, and that was scary. I mean, even England and the States is more diverse, albeit they love to drag a template from Houston or London and whack it into Africa or Asia, but they're very, very experienced, whereas Australia seems to, and as has been evidenced by the government, our way of dealing with the problem is to tell everyone to come home like school children. We're locking it down, we're shutting it down, and let's keep sending iron ore to China while we upset them and cut off lobster, wine and coal exports. How's that going to change though, Tony? I mean, my experience chatting with public servant figures in Australia was that, look, some of them are brilliant, but most of them aren't in listening mode.
Yeah, Australia is struggling with a number of things. Federation is a very good example. Is that the states are acting as their own entities. Australia's never been an imperial or colonial power, so it really struggles to impose said experiences and policies in a colonial or imperialistic manner. So they invariably have ups and downs in terms of their understandings or the blowback or the unintended consequences of how it actually works. As you said before, in terms of Europe and the difference with the US is that, people are relearning lessons from the 1800s, and that is that if you had money and means, you travelled. Mobility was entitlement, and it was an ability to then learn about the world and realise that they don't sound, look, eat the same, sleep the same. They're different, and that was what was called the Grand Tours, which is not the roadshow on Amazon or the BBC's Jeremy Clarkson version. But these Grand Tours were all about the collection of knowledge and differences in philosophy. And when that doesn't happen, people become very introspective and they don't realise the world and they do things in isolation. It's the same as people that troll online and cast aspersions without actually sort of looking or seeking to understand other cultures and other people's opinions. They're very draconian, particularly, those expressions of BOGSAT, a bunch of guys sitting around a table. That's how a lot of security and risk assessments are done. BOGSATs, a bunch of guys and girls sitting around a table, hypothesizing without any real world input. So it's a lot of this naive realism, which is how they perceive it to be, they're really struggling with. And so do a lot of businesses. So when they seek to understand a competitive advantage or produce a product and service, it's often on the smallest of data or outdated data or data that they have selectively collected. And unfortunately, that's what's bringing a lot of governments undone when it comes to pandemics and control factors, is that there isn't a degree of rigour. You can't get rigour or scientific processes introduced overnight to, as you said, an audience that has no scientific pedigree, has no experience, has never understood it before. And so therefore they're espousing what they believe to be scientific principles, but it's not. And this is why you now increasingly start to hear and see academics going, no, that's not it at all. And increasingly the other side of the balanced conversation is now emerging in a lot of media saying, well, great, that's your single narrative, but here's the rest of that data that you've chosen to curate for political purposes. And unfortunately, that's probably gotten worse in the realm of fake news and disinformation. They're trying to assert themselves as a single source of truth, when in fact they are contributing and creating, which is causing all sorts of noise, which conceals the signals. So it's making it much harder, and software is not fixing that as much as the software advocates are espousing it does. And so it's a lot of good old-fashioned detection of what is a con job or a lie or just false information. And people don't adapt those skills overnight, and they're struggling.
Look, we see that on two fronts. Our analytical teams are obviously doing a lot of work to vet what is fact and what is not. And people are making, particularly media agencies and multinationals, and a lot of the big tech companies assume, because it suits them to be playing with artificial intelligence, that everything you're reading and collecting is fact. The reality is social media, everyone can write on it. They're not necessarily political or intelligence expertise there, and there's not necessarily objectivity. A lot of them are just after personal popularity. But we had a classic recently. We and an international NGO were tasked to look at a specific company that was contributing to the military junta in Myanmar. And as you know, we only write for our specific clients, and so everything we write's pretty much been tasked for or written for a very small client base, unlike the global providers that are trying to please, literally hundreds of thousands of clients by writing everything about everybody. And one jersey fits everybody really well, unless you're the little running back and you've got to wear the jersey for the line blocker or vice versa. And we had and talk about the people around the table, and they're experts because they have a voice. We had somebody, a French guy working for a global medical and security company in EMEA, passing judgment on the report we wrote for a specific task to analyse a specific company. So he basically attacked us as a company owned by French doctors, and he was French, funnily enough, and the company we were analysing was French. And he said, but you're not being objective because you haven't actually understood that there are other shareholders, there are other multinational companies that own that. Well, yes, but we're writing it for a specific company and a specific need about a specific company. It was interesting to note this head of vice president, VP, lovely role, in EMEA, decided that he had expertise not only in Myanmar but on the key issues. And the key issues apparently were not funding a junta government that's shooting its own people, that's had several hundred fatalities. He didn't raise that point. He didn't raise the history of that company in Myanmar or elsewhere. He didn't state it was a client of theirs and that he was French and it was a French client. He only focused on there were other shareholders. Now, they're a major shareholder, of course. He didn't raise that either. He just purely picked on a lack of objectivity. Now, obviously, he thinks that we just produce generic reports like they do, where one size fits all, and if you write enough words, you're obviously going to get it right as long as you have a level of objectivity based on only for your clients. But we also found the same in Australia. In Australia, if you don't write what is popular media opinion, then, when I left Australia in 1996, there seemed to be some very good critical thinkers in the media. It's almost like the media in Australia now has to survive by giving airtime to people to talk at lecterns, so that decisions like, we only got AstraZeneca, but don't worry, we're going to get everyone vaccinated, even though we can't currently produce it or authorise it or approve it. But when we can, we're going to get another one now because that first one didn't work and we can't vaccinate people, but we're only going to distribute it through the GPs. And now we're going to jump on the lectern every day so we can cover up that folly